Hello everybody, welcome to the Blythe House Museum of the Dorset Historical Society. My name is John Mathewson, I'm the curator here. Let me temporarily take off my mask. We'd like to welcome you to our October 15th, 2020 Lunchtime Lecture Series. Today we are in for a treat. I've been hearing them rehearsing and oh yes, we are in for a treat. We have today with us Linda Radtke and Cameron Steinmetz accompanying on piano. And they will be performing suffragette songs from 100 years ago, because this is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which made it so that women were no longer denied the right to vote. And this is brought to you by the Dorset Historical Society. A lot of help for this was done by Erica Schott, who is on our board, and also through the Vermont Humanities Council. And we thank all of the above. And without further ado, enjoy.
There's a wave of indignation rolling round and round the land, and its meaning is so mighty, and its mission is so grand, that none of these and cowards dare deny its just demand as we go marching on. Men and brothers, will you do it? Men and brothers, dare you do it? Men and brothers, dare you do it as we go marching on? Ye men who wrong your mothers and your wives and sisters too, how dare you rob companions who are always brave and true? How dare you make them servants who are all too loyal to you as we go marching on? Men and brothers, dare you do it? Men and brothers, dare you do it? Men and brothers, dare you do it as we go on? Whence came your foolish notion, now so lately overgrown, that a woman's sober judgment is not equal to your own? Has God ordained that suffrage is a gift for you alone as we go marching on? Men and brothers, dare you do it? Men and brothers, dare you do it? Men and brothers, dare you do it as we go marching on? Thank you so much for inviting me here to the Dorset Historical Society to talk about suffrage, especially the women's suffrage movement in Vermont. And if you think about back from this costume all the way back to the 1840s, women in hoop skirts and bonnets, and then fast forward to this and then the age of the flapper, the vote were not a gift to women. You know, in some of the textbooks they'll say the vote was given to women in 1920. It took decades and decades of really hard work. Some suffragists were humiliated, sometimes jailed. Others, of course, got great support from their families and their friends. And so what I'd like to do is to talk about the kind of ways that women through those decades made the case for suffrage. It's called From the Parlor to the Polling Place, because women began when they were comfortable just meeting together, talking about the day. And then as they started working on this, often allied with other social justice movements like temperance, abolition, they moved maybe to the church basement if the clergy was supportive of that. And then after a while to the town hall, then to the state peculiar. So we owe a great deal to them. And we know, of course, the fight for voter equity is not over. We have a lot of work to do. So it's hard won, but not done. So in the Vermont History Center, you can see those programs from the early suffrage meetings. Every with song, and they became the League of Women Voters in 1920, once women won the vote. And in these ads, I can see ads for different things like fertilizer, narcotic cure from Burlington, and I didn't see anything about Dr. Phelps' celery tonic, which was manufactured here in Dorset, and apparently besides the celery it had active ingredients that you can alcohol and it was codeine, right? No, it was cocaine.
Cocaine.
It was cocaine.
No.
So I can see that they started with prayer, and they sang, and then they spoke in public. And for a lot of women, that was tough. Quaker women often were encouraged to speak out, but Other times it wasn't really considered acceptable for a lady. So I'm going to dedicate songs to a hero from the suffrage movement. And this first one I'm going to sing is dedicated to Clarina Howard Nichols. She was a journalist from Brattleboro, and boy, she got the trifecta. She worked for abolition, temperance, and women's rights. So she helped get the conversation going here in Vermont. She was the first woman to speak to the men at the Vermont State House. That was 1852. It wasn't so much about the vote. It was married women property rights, child custody, and school suffrage as well. So she became a prominent activist for the abolition movement, moved out to Kansas later on. But here in Vermont, there's a Center for Women and Children called the Clarina Howard Nichols Center. So here's a song from the really early days. It's Civil War, 1863. It's in the parlor song genre. So you see these beautiful covers as sung by Mrs. John Brown or something. And I think this was probably made to be sung in the parlor setting because it's kind of radical for 1863. Here are the words. I will speak my mind if I die to it. Men tell us 'tis fit for wives to submit to their husbands submissively, weakly. And whatever they say, their wives should obey, unquestioning, stupidly, meekly. Our husbands would force us their own dictum take, without ever a wherefore or why for it. But I don't, and I can't, and I won't, and I shan't. No, I will speak my mind if I die for it. For we know it's all fudge to say man's the best judge of what should be and shouldn't, and so on. That woman should bow nor attempt to say how she considers the matter to be done. I never yet gave up myself thus a slave, however my husband might try for it. For I can't, and I won't, and I shan't, and I don't, but I will speak my mind if I die for it. And all ladies, I hope, who with husbands to cope with the rights of the sex will not trifle. We all, if we use our tongue, can all opposition soon stifle. Let man, if he will, now bid us be still and silent. A price he'll pay high for it. For we can't, and we don't, and we shan't. Let us all speak our minds if we die for it. It's clear that early Vermont feminists found the persuasive techniques of humor to work particularly well. And if you look at movements today, think about how we balance our outrage with persuasive techniques, but really how far can you get by being polite? So after a while, they did abandon that early, sort of call it persistence in petticoats. But here's one tactic that really works even today. There is no word in any language, I think, with more emotional power than the word mother. And both pro and anti-suffrage people use that. How can we deny a fundamental right to our mothers? How can we insult them so? So this tune is from the Civil War. You might recognize it. It was sung at rallies. And if you're going to have a rally song, if you use an existing tune, half your work is done. So a lot of times you will find these tunes were taken from hymn tunes or tunes of the day.
You should read these really great titles too. I love it.
Yeah. Bring the good old banner, boys, and fling it to the wind. Sing it to a spirit that calls along. Sing it as we ought to sing it, cheerily and strong. Giving the balance to the mothers. Hurrah, hurrah, we bring the jubilee. Hurrah, hurrah, our spirits shall be free. So we sing this chorus from the mountains to the sea, giving the balance to the mothers. Bring the dear old banner, boys, and fling it to mothers, stop the daughters, let it shelter and defend. Equal rights our motto is, we're loyal to the end, giving the balance to the mothers. Hurrah, hurrah, we bring the jubilee. You might recognize the tune. It was sung at General Sherman's funeral. It's the Union song, Marching Through Georgia. Later on, we see they're taking Confederate songs as well, because the final vote, the final state that voted for ratification was Tennessee in 1920. Changing a little bit. So every year in Vermont, women would bring petitions to the State House, and it would go back and forth. One year the House would say yes, the Senate would say no, then it would flip the next year, then it would go on and on. More and more petitions, more and more women asking and demanding the vote. Perfect storm, both the House and the Senate were going to support legislation to allow women to vote. And the governor at the time, Percival Clement, vetoed it, and they couldn't override the veto. So I'll tell you more about that later on. Here's one that came with new words, and I really love when I see in the upper right. Often if it's initials, that's a woman composer disguising her gender. And I see on the wall here, we have the 300 women who came and registered to vote in 1920, amazing, from a little town like Dorset. And all of them have their first names here as well. In my little town of Middlesex, we had, I think, 18, and many of them were just using Mrs. John Smith, so it's really very difficult to do any research. So what happened at the end when Governor Percival Clement vetoed it is that suffrage did go through, and it was actually ratified here in Vermont in 1921. And Governor Clemens was beaten for the Republican nomination by a pro-suffrage man, Henry Hartness. And so it did sort of work out for the suffrage person. And this one is about how men have to get on the wagon, they have to help women because it's going to happen. And if they don't help, maybe they'll find that women's votes are powerful later on. Well, yeah.
I guess
Yeah, you can do that.
I'll sing with you.
Because Cameron gets to be the unenlightened man at first.
I've been down to Boston, boys, to see the folks and sights. Dear me, I heard such fuss and noise about the women's rights. Now it's just as plain as my old coat, as plain can be, that when the women want to vote, they'll get no help from me. Not from Joe, not from Joe, if he knows it, not from Joseph, no, no, no. Not from Joe, not from me, I tell you no.
Joseph, tell us something new, we're tired of that old song. We'll sow the seeds and cook the meals, to vote won't take us long. We will help clean house, the one too large for men to clean alone. The state and nation, don't you see, when we the vote have won? Yes, we will, and you'll help, for you'll need our help, friend Joseph, yes you will, when we're in, so you better help us win.
You're just right, how blind I've been, I ne'er had seen it thus. 'Tis true that taxes you must pay without a word of fuss. You are subject to the laws men made, and yet no word or note. Can you sing out where it will count? I'll help you win the vote. Yes, I will.
Thank you, Joe.
Soon together we'll be voters, yes I will. If you'll all vote yes at the polls next fall.
Here's another Vermonter who worked tirelessly for women's rights, Annette Parmalee of Enosburg Falls. And she was a Methodist. Methodist was very involved in the temperance movement. She and her husband worked for that. And also she wanted to have women on the board of all the poorhouses, all the so-called insane asylums, anywhere where women were. And they called her Annette the Suffragette, but it was a derogatory term, and also Annette the Hornet, because she never did give up. But she understood the value of human rights. Men didn't want to get yelled at all the time. And so she had this rally where the top things on the broadside said, should men be able to vote? And they were having a hearing about it, because they said one thing is men are too emotional. If you see them at a sporting game, they're out of control with their emotions. They just can't hold it back. And also whenever there's a problem, a conflict, men can't see beyond the need for force to solve it. So she thought women could really add quite a bit. And one effective strategy you could hear in the last song was the idea of women's sphere being a clean home, a safe home, bringing up children. They prepare good food. And they thought if women were voting, we could help clean up the wider world of our community and our nation. So we're not upending that, we're keeping our traditional role, and we're sort of getting into the dirtiness of politics. So this one is a sort of a, well, it's a song you know, it's a patriotic song. And that was another nice way to turn around to the ideals of the revolution, the idea of taxation without representation. So I found, I think, 4 sets of the suffrage song, but this is the best one. It's called Uncle Sam's Wedding. We have percussion. Of all the songs that have been sung within the states and nation, there's none that comes so near to heart as Uncle Sam's relation. Yankee Doodle is his name, U.S. is honored station. Red and white and starry blue, his garb on each occasion. When Uncle Sam set up his house, he welcomed every brother, but in the haste of his new life, he quite forgot his mother. Now his house is up in arms, a housewife he must find him, to sweep and dust and set to right the tangles all around him. Now your favorite verse. Uncle Sam is long in years, and he is growing wiser. He can see 'twas a mistake to have no misadvisor. His nephews now have got the reins and looking o'er their shoulder, shout to dear old Uncle Sam, goodbye old man forever. Now we're here, dear Uncle Sam, to help you in your trouble, and the first thing best to do is making you a double. Yankee Doodle will be glad to join in us in spreading the news abroad are all the land of Uncle Sam's great wedding. And I love the cover of some of this sheet music because this shows Uncle Sam in the red, white, and blue, and then this lady there with a broom. So there are a lot of assumptions about women in this initial time. You know, it's the proper sphere for women to be doing charitable work. And if you vote, you also have a voice in the political action. And Jane Addams, for example, of Hull House, she wanted laws to be passed for pure food and water, sanitation, child welfare, and she knew that we needed men, women needed men, and men needed women to make this happen. And she wrote, true harmony in government requires the soprano as well as the bass. So this is called Votes for Women.
Altos and tenors are good too.
Altos and tenors can help too. Yeah. And it's written by a husband and wife team. Edward wrote the words and Mrs. Edward wrote the music. And the reason I picked this is it has this one line that breaks my heart. She said, the joyless haunt of drudges where children toil and die. And so there are more and more public marches taking on the role of children in our society. So this was a slow march, and my costume, I don't know if you can see it all, but it's the hems went up above, sort of at the ankle or above, because women were doing a lot of marching. They couldn't have those big hoop skirts anymore. And they did public marches. What means this votes for women? Just this, the time has come when we make voice with free men concerns of wife and home, and snap the ancient tether enthralling us too long, and stoutly pull together to right a grievous wrong. Shout the song of votes for women, ring it out upon the air. Hear its note, ye patriot freemen, who the right will dare sing aloud with lusty vigor, till it rattles earth and sky, that the woman's cause grows bigger and the woman's day draws nigh. The votes of sisters, mothers, in every sovereign state, for us and many others, God's vote, ye patriot freemen, who the right will dare, sing aloud with lusty vigor, till it rattles earth and sky, that the woman's cause grows bigger, and the woman's day draws nigh. When women finally got to vote, and we were in it was St. Albans, and in the women's section of the paper, they had sort of description of what they wore, the oldest and the youngest going in their best finery to vote for the first time. And then it said in the second paragraph that the women protested because they were given pencils to fill out their ballots. And I couldn't understand that, ballots with pencils. But all I can think of is maybe they didn't trust, at that point being their first time voting, and we hear that coming up today too. They didn't trust that their votes would be counted, that somebody might erase it later on. I think some of the resistance to women's voting came from business interests because they were worried about enacting child labor laws or perhaps labor unions, more pay, decent working conditions, things like that. And a lot of those were interests of the suffragists who got in the legislature. And our first female representative in the Vermont State House was in 1921, Edna Beard from Orange, and she proposed limiting a child's workday from 10 to 8 hours, and it didn't pass. A lot of times women tried to enlist the church because certainly the religion was important to them, and sometimes that worked well and sometimes it didn't work so well. And one of the reasons it didn't work well is some of the early suffragists, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, saw the church as a patriarchy, saw the church as really harmful to the interests of women. And so that was sort of a source of tension between the different movements as they went ahead. But here are lyrics to a song that I couldn't find the music for, but it's probably a hymn tune or something, but I wanted to read you the poem because it's so amazing. Votes for Women by Mary Louise Carleton. There is no realm in earth's domain, mongst birds nor beasts nor bees, where such unequal code doth reign as that which man decrees. Who holds that women have no part nor place in council grave, who holds that men alone are smart and pure and wise and brave. Thou relic of a bygone age, shall we thy truth admit? Shall never man turn o'er the page on which was error writ? Shall we ne'er waken from the night we dwelt in cave and tree, when simple force of might made right, when women mute must be? 'Twas said not many years ago by men wise and discreet that women had no souls, you know, but only hands and feet. These days we've souls, that's some relief, but still the fact remains, according to man's best belief, we are sadly short of brains. Day follows night and darkness flees, at dawn of justice reigns, when inequality shall cease, in council all may share. Why should not women work with man to speed the coming day? In fact, the plan that God hath had always. So they did use the rhetoric of the Christian church, often the hymn tunes as well, to link those beliefs together to what the religion was telling them. This next song was an example of using a hymn tune for a political rally, and this was performed all over New England by the and it was featured especially in the nation's centennial. So if you can imagine, it's 1876, women still don't vote, but we're looking at 1976, we're looking 100 years hence and imagining the utopia that this country could be. We have an organ here in the room. You may know this tune.
Whoops. Putting the right key for you.
Thank you. 100 years hence, what a change will be made in politics, morals, religion, and trade, in statesmen who wrangle or ride on the fence. These things will be all 100 years hence. Our laws then will be uncompulsory rules, our prisons converted to national schools. The pleasure of sinning, it's all a pretense, and so for sure. Conventions will then be a useful expense. All go free suffrage 100 years hence. Instead of speech making to satisfy wrong, all join the glad chorus to sing freedom song. And if the millennium is no pretense, we'll all be good neighbors 100 years hence. Amen. I love the confidence in that song, that spirit of the progressive era, that the utopian idealism of that the nation indeed could rise up to the promise of its creed, journeys that we're still on today. Where I grew up is in Seneca Falls, New York, which is the Finger Lakes, and that's the site of the 1848 Women's Rights Convention, sometimes seen as marking the beginning of the American movement. Obviously, lots of things going on before that, but they were led by three women meeting in a parlor: the Quaker Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And when I grew up in Seneca Falls, women's history wasn't really taught that much. Where the Women's Museum is now was a laundromat, actually, with a New York State sign out there. And I didn't really know who Elizabeth Cady Stanton was particularly, but I saw her picture in the school, and she looked like Mrs. Santa Claus. And I couldn't believe when I started to read what she wrote, what a radical she was, all the way to the end of her life. Sometimes that led to a schism in the movement. But she really saw the church as advocating the oppression of women. She wrote the Women's Bible, where she really takes it on. So she's radical. One suffragist from that area, from the Finger Lakes where I grew up, was Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And she took on the church as well because she had been studying the culture of the Native Americans in that area. And she saw that women could vote there. Women took part in the decisions of the group. And so she said the European idea, the divine order, is not necessarily what God decrees. So again, it was a big split. She also, by the way, believed, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did, that motherhood should be voluntary, that you should choose whether or not to have children. So the one part that allowed women to have that courage to continue to work and to demand and to organize had to do with the training grounds of two movements. One was abolition, so very strong here in Vermont, and temperance work. And Quakers were very, they had the training to be able to speak. But the way this Women's Rights Convention started in Seneca Falls was the abolition anti-slavery conference was happening in London. And it was 1940. And so Lucretia Mott and Susan B. and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to London and found out that women could not be at the convention. It was for the men only. And so it was a 3-day convention. The first day they just debated whether or not these women should be allowed to participate. At the end of the day they said, no, but you can sit up in the balcony and watch the proceedings. So in my mind, I think of this, it would be a great play to think about what these three women were talking about when they spent the next 2 days watching the men make decisions. And when I got back home, I think that was part of the beginnings of women's rights work. However, at the first conference, voting wasn't the big thing. It was at the end of the articles in the Declaration of Sentiments, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote it, but Lucretia Mott said, "Thou will make us look ridiculous, Lizzie." So in other words, asking for the vote at that point she thought was too much. But unfortunately, this is the ugly part of the movement. They worked so tirelessly for abolition of slavery and for the 15th Amendment that they hoped that they would be included in that, and they weren't. And they felt a great betrayal. At one point, Wendell Phillips was a great abolition worker, said, "This is not the woman's hour, this is the Negro's hour. The country can't face too much disruption at one time, so just wait." And so that's the part that is incredibly disturbing. I mean, they used arguments against black men voting, against immigrants voting, really ugly. They totally betrayed their African American sisters who were also working for suffrage. So that's the ugly part of the movement that I think we need to face. There was one woman who went to the 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, only one in 1920 who was still alive and able to vote. She had been a working woman and a Quaker, and she, with her friends, went to the convention and worked for her whole life in Philadelphia. And finally, she was 91 years old when the vote happened. The next song has to do with looking at men who were allowed to vote and women who weren't, and pointing at the men and saying how they're undesirable voters, they're drunkards, they're ignorant, they're foreigners, they don't speak English, and yet here I am, I went to Vassar College, why can't I vote? So they acted like it was fewer rights for them if more people got rights. So this next one, oh, you get to sing this one. It talks about the Irish especially, and they use a term from the Bible, Gog and Magog, who were bad guys, I guess, in the Bible. And it's a Scottish tune.
I'll come around by the end of this one again.
Okay.
I'll not remain unenlightened.
Oh.
Oh no, this is the one that you sang without me,
That's right.
about Gog and Magog, and that I always am so eager to do the next one.
Well,
Sorry.
that's okay. I get to talk about Lucy Stone, another one of my heroes. And she said, it's easier to see a drunkard than a principal. And she said, you know, look at these drunkards going to the polls. So there we go. If the men should see the women going to the polls, to put down the liquor traffic, needed vex their souls. If we're angels, tell us, can we once suppose that all the men will frown on us when going to the polls? No discharge have Christian women from the war with sin. At the polls with Gog and Magog must our fight begin. Since we'd Bible marching orders, it needed fright our souls. Through all the men will frown on us when going to the polls. We love our boys, our household joys. We love our girls as well. The law of love is from above. Against that we ne'er rebel. There was a huge wave of newcomers in the 1880s when my folks came here, and many people argued for educated suffrage. How they defined educated was reading and writing English. And so, of course, they wanted to restrict any of the foreigners, anybody that they thought was, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, the steerage. And in Vermont, again, Annette Parmalee published 17 arguments for women's suffrage. And here's number 6. Since there are 3 times as many native-born women as foreign-born men and women, giving women the vote would increase representation. So it's still there. It's still there. This is a song that talks about women's sphere. Certainly many of these women, most of the women at the beginning, were women of some means. They were not wage-earning women. They had the time, sometimes the support, and often the money to take time off to work on this. And this takes 2 views of men. The man, the first one is the negative one, and of course a drunk. And the next one is the enlightened one. And this is a Bobby Burns tune as well that was popular during the Civil War. This is the one Cameron gets to sing.
Take 2.
Yeah. I have a neighbor, one of those not very hard to find, who knows it all without debate and never changes mind. I asked him what of women's rights, he said in tone severe,
My mind on that is all made up, keep woman in her sphere.
I saw a man in tattered garb forth from the pump house come. He squandered all his cash for drink and starved his wife at home. I asked him, should not women vote? He answered with a sneer,
I've taught my wife to know her place, keep woman in her sphere.
I met an earnest, thoughtful man not many days ago, who pondered deep all human love, the honest truth to know. I asked him, what of women's cause? The answer
just the same as mine. Let woman choose her sphere.
At the turn of the century, things start to change a bit in terms of the complexion, the kind of people who are working for women's suffrage. As I said, at the beginning of those years, they were mostly women of some means, and they had some relief from the work at home. Elizabeth Cady Stanton did the writing, not so much the traveling, because she had 7 children. But at the turn of the century, especially after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is in 1911, some suffragists joined with the urban working class, speaking on street corners. Think about how far that is from the parlor meetings earlier, and sometimes getting the foreign language leaflets that they could pass out to the workers. So I found one in German, and also I found an interesting suffragist that I wanted to talk about. Her name was Ernestine Rose. She was born in a ghetto in Poland. Her father was a rabbi, and she ended up coming to America and working for temperance and abolition and the rights of married women to hold property and also religious tolerance. So she worked with Susan B. Anthony. And the problem was that since many of these women were connected to the faith community, especially the Protestant Christian church, Ernestine Rose ended up saying, I'm an atheist. And that, again, was a rift in the kind of women who were working together. So I had to find something that represented the working women, especially down Hester Street in New York, that New York voted for suffrage before Vermont. And one of the reasons was all the working women there. And State Representative Avram Pat translated this Yiddish song for me. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about her, Bessie Tomaszewski, who sang the song. She was the queen of Yiddish theater and had a very colorful life, Bessie Tomaszewski. And so here is sort of a translation that Avram gave. The time will come when women will be equal to men, will have all the power that men now hold. We will have the right to come home in the middle of the night dead drunk from the saloon and will no longer work like slaves. In the future, what's more, we will keep our flat bellies and the men and the babies for us. And elections will be in our hands. The president will kiss every woman 300 times. And we'll be the police, so we'll stand on the street corners, and when a thief is caught, he'll just give us a kiss and we're free. So this is the comic theater of Bessie Tomaszewski, and I'll do my best with the Yiddish. Es bringt jetzt auch raus die Zeit, ich denn es ist nicht durch euch schlecht. Aber wenn sein Kleid mit Leid, sie kämpfen so hoch und gerecht. Verschiedene Frauen bin allerlei außen, seinen Kleider ausbrennen. Sie laufen Armen mit Spitzen die Gasen, sie machen mit die Männer. In sie schweigen, prüfen und treiben, wenn nicht mit ihr denn rein. Vor den Bitten, hat nie sie viel den Mann. Tot die Mäuler, fett veracht sei schlecht. Kein Kind erschwitzigen, fährt ihm bald in die Seen. Ständig grüßt, schweifellos, Leben zu Frauenrecht. Lei, 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 lei. Stellt sie grüßt, schweifellos, Leben zu Frauenrecht. Oh. And Bessie Tomaszewski finally went to Hollywood, working for their husband. Their son shortened his name, and he is the conductor Michael Tilson Thomas. Wonderful PBS documentary about the Tomaszewskis. So now we get to the final step to ratify in all 36 states. We're in 1919, and a lot of that is told in a wonderful book by Elaine Weiss called The Woman's Hour. And it reads like a thriller, even though you know it eventually passed in Tennessee. The movie is going to be produced by Hillary Clinton and Steven Spielberg's studio. It's a riveting story. I recommend the book. And it's 6 weeks. So it's summer 1920 in Tennessee, the last state. And this is where it gets ugly because to appease some Southerners, the suffragettes decided to kind of abandon their black sisters. And it just made the point about white women voting because the vote was suppressed for black men already there. So I wondered about why why Tennessee? Because there was also Connecticut and Vermont left over in the East. But they thought they could exploit the racial hatred of politicians and say, your white supremacy will be bolstered again if you open the door to white women. And so they would continue to have poll taxes, of course, and so-called literacy tests, issues of voter equity that we still have today. So if you think about the early, very genteel modes of persuasion, and then later on, how radical it became for women to stand up in public, and even in front of the White House picketing. And this is where it's interesting. There's a woman from Vermont, if you've been to Shelburne Museum, her name was Louisine Havemeyer, the mother of Electra Havemeyer Webb at Shelburne Museum. She collected art, but she got arrested for trying to burn an effigy of President Wilson. So she, with Alice Paul, founded the National Woman's Party, which was seen by the other side as kind of traitors because they crossed that line by boldly picketing right in front of the White House during wartime. And at one point they had a sign that said Kaiser Wilson. And so some suffragists were seen as vulgar, kind of abandoning that high ground. And they were so worried that women would sort of be unsexed by this behavior. But it finally passed, and that's a great story. It had to do with one vote. And every time a state became ratified, they would sew a star on this banner, Alice Paul would, and show it to everyone. So this final one, she did the star, and church bells rang in churches that Sunday all around the country, except in Texas, where they had a minute of silence. So, and in the Northfield Town Hall, I read that the men went to the town hall, the sawdust that had been put down there to get their tobacco on, spit their tobacco on, and they put up chairs along the sides so the ladies could safely be seated at town hall. So here is the one about the last star, and it's again a Confederate anthem called Bonnie Blue Flag. And I think it's beginning to sound a little more jazzy.
Let's try that again.
There is a band of women, and to our men are born. From the darkness past and looking toward the morn. Their mothers labored, waited through a night without a star. The morning showed the suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. Hurrah, hurrah, for equal rights, hurrah, hurrah, for the suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. This band is all reforming, war shall be an end. Bayonets and swords shall rust, we'll use the brain our band. Laden with precious prey now, thunders the progress bar. The headlight waves a suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. Hurrah, hurrah, for equal rights, hurrah, hurrah, for the suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. Hurrah, hurrah, for equal rights, hurrah, hurrah, for the suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. So that was a joyous time. November 2nd, 1920. These women here in Dorset, they were they were paying taxes, so that gave them the possibility of voting. And they signed up and voted in that election. And about 3 women for every 5 men voted. And a couple of the people who did were Eleanor Roosevelt, voted for the first time that day. The first, Edith Wilson. Wilson was not for suffrage initially, but politically he kind of got drawn along. And my grandmother, Minnie Clemens Williams, she voted too. So the first time voters in Vermont were 10,000 strong. As I said, they were able to defeat Governor Percival Clement. But now, my costume, you think about how the music has changed over those years from the parlor songs, kind of Stephen Foster type things, or Irish folk songs, to more jazzy tunes. So we're going to end with, actually it's not, we're going to do a little sing-along at the end, but this song you can tell, it's 1916, it's a publishing company that George Gershwin worked for, and it's interesting because these lyrics still emphasize mother as the very first song did, but it's also the mother of your children. How can you not only disrespect your own mother, but your wife, your mother, your children, who you entrust with so much responsibility. So this is called best title and best cover design. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. And I'm going to dedicate this to Helena Whitney, the first woman on the Dorset School Board. She served from 1919 to 1922, and she's on this wall. So when the museum is open, do come in and look at this exhibit. Amazing amount of research, and sometimes pictures of the women. Take it away, Cameron. No man is greater than his mother. No man is half so good. No man is better than the wife he loves. Her love will guide him, whatever betide him. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else would kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you're all lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. Men plunge this world in war and sadness. She must invest in vain. Let's hope and pray someday you'll hear her say, stop all your madness, I bring you gladness. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else will kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you're all lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. Thank you. Well, we began with the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and it went through so many different lyrics in the generations. I remember Solidarity Forever, which was in the 70s, I think it is. But let's sing just two more verses that I found that are applicable right now because we're voting right now. It's a very important election year. We're thinking about voter equity, and we're thinking about what women have to contribute to the political scene in this country. So, this is a sing-along maybe. We'll end with Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, so you can sing that at home. It's a right to serve our nation in its every hour of need, a right to sit in judgment of her country's faith and creed, and show the world her courage by some high heroic deed as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As she goes marching on. It's her right to train the children in the home and in the school, to help in framing statutes and determine who shall rule, and like men to cast her ballot for a statesman or a fool as she is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as we go marching on. Thank you very much, and don't forget to vote. Thank you. Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you, Cameron. This was a great performance. Thank you for joining us, and we'll let you know when we have our next virtual event. And have a great day.
Be well, be safe.